Okay, so, quick show of hands, who here has ever had a bad boss? Someone who micromanages, who somehow knows exactly what you did wrong before you even open your mouth, who's just constantly 2 steps ahead of you and enjoying it? Now imagine that boss also runs literal hell, has been doing so for longer than most civilizations have existed, and considers your eternal damnation less unfortunate outcome and more acceptable overhead. Congratulations, viewer, today we're talking about Asmodeus, and I promise you by the end of this video you're going to walk away thinking the scariest thing in the 9 hells isn't the fire, isn't the torture, isn't the demons trying to break in from next door. It's the paperwork. It's always the paperwork. I've talked about a top-tier evil deity before with Lolth, and look, she's still awful, I stand by everything I said, but Lolth runs her show through fear and random murder tests and vibes. Asmodeus runs his through something far more horrifying to anyone who's ever had a job, an organizational chart that simply will not let you leave. So let's actually get into who this guy is. Asmodeus is the Lord of the 9 hells, the Supreme Ruler of Baator, and depending on which setting or sourcebook you're reading, he's either a god in the full sense of the word or something stranger and older that the multiverse just agreed to call a god because the alternative explanation was worse. He's worshipped as a deity across many worlds, while other cultures treat him as something even older than the gods themselves, and honestly, that's a very on-brand ambiguity for a guy whose entire strategy is never letting anyone know exactly how powerful or vulnerable he actually is. Physically, he's not what you'd expect from a guy who runs the worst timeshare in the multiverse. No wings, no comically oversized horns dripping ichor. He's a tall, thin, striking figure, horned, red-skinned, red-eyed, dressed like he raided the finest tailor in the multiverse, and his skin is marked with old half-healed scars from a fall that happened before most calendars started counting. He looks less like a monster and more like the world's most charismatic evil CEO, and that's deliberate. You don't run a bureaucracy by looking like you eat orphans on your lunch break. You run it by looking like the kind of guy your grandmother would trust with her retirement fund right before he takes it all and calls it a processing fee. Now, origin story time, and buckle up, because Asmodeus has, and I cannot stress this enough, several completely contradictory origin stories, which is itself the most Asmodeus thing about him. One version has him starting off as an ancient serpent god from the dawn of creation, a being who was around before most of the current pantheon even existed. Another, more common version says he used to be an angel, one of the greatest of them, a general who led the forces of heaven itself against ancient enemies. In this telling he served faithfully under a god known only as He Who Was, but came to believe his master was far too soft, too forgiving, and unwilling to actually use force when force was called for. Which, fascinating, because that means the literal devil's origin story is, at its core, my boss wouldn't let me be tougher on people. Somewhere out there, a middle manager just felt a chill and doesn't know why. After that war ended, Asmodeus was assigned guard duty over the prison of an ancient imprisoned evil god, and it was there that a demon lord found him, whispered in his ear, and helped nudge his simmering resentment into full rebellion. So depending on the telling, Asmodeus didn't even come up with the "actually let's do evil" plan himself. He got recruited. The original devil, the platonic ideal of corruption and temptation, needed someone else to tempt him first. There's a joke in there somewhere about even Satan having a Satan, and I'm not going to not make it. There's also a wilder theory floating around in some corners of the lore, one where Asmodeus's true nature isn't angelic or serpentine at all, but demonic, that he clawed his way up from being an actual demon of the abyss, reinvented himself, and buried that history so completely that not even he remembers it anymore. The idea is that somewhere in ancient, half-forgotten archives, there are records of what he did before he started climbing the infernal ladder, and that even Asmodeus himself has lost track of where he actually came from. And listen, I love this theory specifically because it means the ultimate lawful evil bureaucrat of the cosmos might have started out as an unhinged chaos demon who got tired of anarchy, invented rules, and became so good at rules that he forgot he ever hated them. That's not evolution, that's a full identity crisis played out over several millennia, and frankly, relatable. Whichever version you pick, and to be honest as a DM you should just pick the one that's funniest for your table, the through line is always the same. Something happened. Somebody fell. And out of that fall came a being who reinvented itself so thoroughly, so convincingly, that the truth got buried under the myth on purpose. He rebuilt himself into Asmodeus, Lord of the Nine Hells, and wove a story so dense and so old that basically nothing left alive is ancient enough to actually call him a liar to his face. The only being who apparently does know the real truth is a goddess of serpent people who has, as far as anyone can tell, simply decided not to bring it up. Which is either the pettiest form of blackmail leverage in the multiverse, or she just genuinely doesn't care, and honestly both options are extremely funny to me. So that's how he became a devil. Here's how he became the devil, the actual Lord of the Ninth, and this is where the bureaucrat stuff really kicks in. Because unlike a lot of archdevils who clawed their way to power through raw strength or being uniquely terrifying, Asmodeus's rise reads less like a war epic and more like the world's most evil episode of The Office. He apparently started at the very bottom of Hell's caste system, as basically nothing, a lemure, the lowest rung any damned soul gets turned into, and worked his way up through raw competence, cunning, and a truly staggering amount of backstabbing. Every rung of that ladder, somebody else got shoved off it. Eventually he clawed his way into the infernal bureaucracy proper, became Chancellor of Hell itself, effectively the personal right hand to whoever was running things at the time, and then, in an event usually called the Infernal Usurpation, he overthrew the previous Lord of the Ninth entirely and took the throne for himself. And he's held it, more or less uncontested, ever since. That's not a guy who won a war. That's a guy who worked his way up from the mailroom and then fired the CEO. Here's the part that I think makes Asmodeus genuinely one of the scariest things in the entire multiverse, scarier than any Tarrasque, scarier than most gods honestly, and it's this: he might not actually be the one running things anymore. There's a compelling read on Asmodeus where his original goal, way back when he first took the throne, was reform. He wanted to wind down the endless, pointless slaughter of the blood war against the demons and consolidate Hell's forces instead of constantly bleeding them out, figuring that without devils to fight, the demons would eventually just collapse into infighting on their own. A genuinely rational, almost sympathetic goal, all things considered. And then he discovered the horrible truth: Hell itself had already decided the blood war was its purpose, its directive, and it didn't actually care what Asmodeus wanted. The armies keep marching, the borders stay defended, the soul harvest continues, all of it running on autopilot regardless of what the guy nominally in charge thinks about it, because Hell was never really about any one individual. It's a machine, cold, self-sustaining, and even something as powerful and clever as Asmodeus eventually just gets absorbed into serving its will instead of the other way around. If you're getting flashbacks to every prestige TV show about institutions eating the people who try to reform them from the inside, you are correct, that's exactly the vibe, and no, I'm not going to pretend I didn't laugh out loud reading that for the first time. So what does Asmodeus actually have left, if the machine runs itself? Mostly propaganda, and his own position within infernal politics, and he pours basically everything he has into maintaining both. Which honestly explains a lot about why he survived this long. He doesn't need to win fights. He needs to make sure nobody ever gets organized enough to challenge him, and he does that through pure, relentless, exhausting political maintenance. This is a guy who has been in middle management so long he became the ultimate middle manager of reality, and the position promoted itself around him. Let's talk logistics, because Asmodeus runs the most terrifyingly efficient hostile workplace in the cosmos. He rules from Nessus, the ninth and deepest layer of the Nine Hells, out of a fortress called Nalshim, and beneath him are the other 8 lords of the Nine, each ruling one layer like regional managers who all despise each other and are actively trying to get promoted over the corpse of whoever's currently ahead of them. Zariel runs Avernus, the first layer, a fallen angel he handed command of Hell's armies to. Despater holds the second layer from inside a tower so paranoid he's rendered himself literally immune to harm while inside it, at the cost of never really being able to leave. Mammon's the greedy one, obviously. Fierna, a rageful seductress with a short fuse, holds the fourth. Levistus, frozen solid in an iceberg as punishment for crossing Asmodeus, technically still holds the fifth even while trapped. Mephistopheles, second only to Asmodeus in raw power, sits on the eighth and is constantly, quietly scheming to take the top job. And running the sixth is his own daughter, Glacia, who by most accounts genuinely admires her dad while also actively working to undermine him, which honestly might just be how every family business works, fantasy or otherwise. Any of these lords of hell can be appointed or deposed by Asmodeus whenever he decides it's necessary, and his reasoning for doing so isn't always clear to anyone else, which is precisely the point, because it means every single archdevil under him has to stay loyal purely out of uncertainty rather than trust. That's the genius of the whole system. Nobody knows exactly where they stand, so nobody dares move first. And he watches all of it. He keeps spies scattered across every layer, plants embedded in every single court, and nobody, not even the archdevils themselves, is ever fully sure who among their own inner circle is secretly loyal to Asmodeus instead, which keeps the entire hierarchy locked in a permanent, fully justified state of paranoia. This isn't a guy who needs to personally intimidate you. He's built an entire surveillance apparatus so thorough that everyone intimidates themselves on his behalf. That's next level. That's the kind of management style that would get written up in a business school case study if business schools were run by war criminals. He can also project himself in ways that make this even worse. Asmodeus can maintain up to 10 avatars of himself active simultaneously, which means he can effectively have a piece of his attention on every single layer of hell at once, with a spare left over for business outside of it. 10 simultaneous Asmodeuses just casually wandering around making sure things are running correctly, and you'll never know which conversation you're having is with the real deal or a projection, because functionally, for you, there's no difference. This is a guy who invented remote work oversight before remote work existed. His symbol of office is the ruby rod, and yes, that's genuinely what it's called, a magical rod that marks him as the rightful ruler of all of hell, said to have been forged from the blood of 1,000 mortal sacrifices, because of course it was. Nothing about this guy's aesthetic is subtle once you actually look at the details. If Despater's whole thing is paranoid isolation and Mephistopheles is scheming intellect, Asmodeus's whole thing is turning literal genocide into interior decorating. And it's not just devils who answer to him. On the material plane, Asmodeus has more mortal cultists than every other archdevil put together, and pulls in worshippers from nearly every race and culture, even from within societies that consider themselves firmly on the side of good. He's associated with tyranny, oppression, domination, indulgence, and damnation, and his clerics tend to be charismatic, influential people who naturally end up as leaders within their communities. That's the real horror of Asmodeus. He's not lurking in some cave waiting for adventurers to stumble in. He's already sitting on your local city council. He's already the guy your friend's business partner introduced you to at a networking event who seemed a little too smooth. Every tiefling with infernal blood ultimately traces some small piece of their heritage back to a deal this guy either made directly or benefits from indirectly, which, incidentally, is a big part of why tieflings get treated like garbage in a lot of settings even though the vast majority of them never signed a single contract with anybody. Even after the Reckoning, a massive shakeup where the archdevils were forced to answer for their conduct and several of them got outright replaced, demoted, or cursed into forms they despised, Asmodeus walked away basically untouched. Some of his old allies got their realms handed right back with no real consequence, others got saddled with humiliating punishments but kept their thrones anyway, and a couple of genuinely defiant lords got quietly and permanently swapped out. Through all of it, Asmodeus himself stayed exactly where he was. Everyone else in the org chart got shuffled, demoted, iced, or replaced, and the guy at the very top didn't even have to raise his voice. So, running an Asmodeus-centric arc in your own game, here's my actual advice. Do not, under any circumstances, have your players fight Asmodeus directly at anything less than a mythic, world-ending, capstone of the campaign level, because if they do and they somehow win, you have just broken your entire cosmology and now every god in the setting owes your party a fruit basket and possibly their throne. The fun of Asmodeus isn't a boss fight. It's the slow, dawning horror of realizing that the noble house your party has been serving, the merchant contract they signed, the wish they made to a suspiciously polite stranger, all of it quietly traces back to him, 3 layers removed, completely legal, fully consensual on paper. Let your players win small, local victories against his agents. Let them think they're making progress. And then, maybe, let them realize that the entire time, they were doing exactly what a piece of infernal paperwork somewhere always said they would. Because that's Asmodeus. Not the loudest devil. Not even, some would argue, the strongest devil pound for pound. But the only one who built a system so perfect that it no longer needs him to keep running, and stuck around at the top of it anyway purely because leaving would mean admitting somebody else might do a better job. Honestly, out of every horrifying immortal being I've covered on this channel, he might be the most realistic. We've all had that boss. As always, if you wouldn't mind liking, commenting, and subscribing, that would be greatly appreciated. And if not, hey, thank you for watching anyway. Take care out there, and have a good one.